I'm your host, Nick Jikomes, and today I'm speaking with Rob Henderson. Just a reminder, I've started a new weekly newsletter, the Mind and Matter newsletter, that goes out every Friday. You can sign up in the link in the episode description or on my website, www.nickjikomes.com. And that newsletter is really a way for me to give people updates on the podcast, such as who the upcoming guests will be. I will also share interesting studies that have come out in the research world that I find interesting that I'm looking at, as well as links to interesting news articles that are science related that I think are noteworthy. And I will also share things like excerpts and quotes from some of the books and other literature that I'm reading. So today's guest is Rob Henderson. He's actually a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Cambridge. He studies psychology. Before that, he got his bachelor's degree at Yale University, where he studied with Paul Bloom, I believe. And Rob has a really interesting background, which we talked about. He started from a relatively unprivileged position in life and eventually made his way to first the military and then to Yale before moving on to his PhD program. So he sort of tells that story for us. And Rob is generally interested in topics related to human nature and human psychology. In particular, we talked a lot about human social status hierarchies, what social status is, why people seek it out, and this concept of luxury beliefs, which Rob has coined. Why people actually believe the things they believe, and how sometimes they believe things not necessarily for the belief per se, but as a way to signal their position in a social hierarchy and actually use their beliefs as a kind of weapon against people who they might view as competitors for social status. If you're interested in human nature or why people behave the way they behave, I encourage you to listen to this episode and also follow Rob on social media or sign up for his newsletter. I will link to all of those things in the episode description. Today's show is brought to you in part by Dosist, an all-natural cannabis company specializing in dose-controlled cannabis products made with plant-based ingredients. To learn more about Dosist, their products, and where they are available, please visit their website through the link in the episode description. Hey everyone, I want to take just a minute to tell you about an app I am partnering with called Readwise. Readwise is an app that organizes and helps you get the most out of your digital highlights. I use it to organize all the highlights I make in my digital books on my Kindle, and so if you're like me and you make a lot of highlights and you like to revisit them often to refresh your memory, Readwise is the perfect app. You can also take photos of any physical books you've highlighted and upload those. It also has cool features that allow you to share your favorite highlights and quotes from books on social media, and it syncs with note-taking apps like Evernote, Notion, and Roam. You can tag, search, and organize your notes and highlights on Readwise, and it helps you connect ideas in new ways and retain more of what you read. So if you click the link in the episode description, you can get Readwise for free for 2 months when you sign up for their annual plan. That plan is only $7.99 per month, and it's a relatively new app, so they're adding new features often, and if you sign up for the annual plan today, you can lock in that price, which will stay at $7.99 even if the price increases in the future as they add more. So if you do a lot of highlighting and note-taking and you want a good way to organize all that information, check out the link in the episode description. And with that, here's my conversation with Rob Henderson. Rob Henderson, thank you for joining me.
Hey, Nick. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you start off by just telling people what you do right now and what you're interested in, generally speaking?
Yeah, sure. So right now I am a PhD student here at the University of Cambridge in England, studying social and evolutionary psychology. My views or my interests are sort of wide ranging. I'm interested in things like social status, social class. A lot of my PhD work is sort of on moral judgment and morality, sort of loosely related to a lot of Jonathan Haidt's work. Yeah, so sort of all of that stuff. I'm interested in sort of conformity, social influence, sort of how people can influence the behaviors of others by what they're doing, and sort of hierarchy, prestige, all of those kinds of things.
I wonder if your interests have anything to do with the trajectory that you've taken to get where you're at, because it's quite a unusual trajectory. Most people who make it to Cambridge or to Yale don't get there through the path that you did. So can you give everyone sort of an overview of where your life started and how it sort of changed at some of these critical inflection points on your journey?
So to your question, like you said, so currently I'm studying at Cambridge. Before this, I studied psychology at Yale as an undergrad. I was a research assistant there under Paul Bloom in his lab. And, before all of this, before I sort of entered these kind of fancy universities, my life was a lot different. So to just back, way, way up, I had this sort of circuitous path journey to higher education. I was born in Los Angeles to my mother, who very quickly became addicted to drugs shortly after I was born. She was an immigrant from South Korea, and she succumbed to her addiction, so she was unable to care for me. Don't know who my father is, never met him. And so I was placed into foster homes in LA County when I was 3 years old, spent a good portion of my early childhood sort of bouncing around 7 different foster homes in total. Really didn't do well in school, was changing schools like every 3 to 6 months, was just totally unfocused. I was later adopted into this family, moved in with them into a town called in Northern California called Red Bluff, which is kind of this more rural blue collar town, populations like 13,000. Kind of a lot of poverty in that area. The median household income when I moved there was like $27,000 median household income. Pretty high poverty rates, a lot of drug abuse, kind of a rundown area. My adoptive parents, they were able to create a pretty stable home for me. I had an adoptive sister too. I still do. We grew close, but then after a couple of years into the adoption, my adoptive parents divorced, and that was pretty hard on me. My adoptive father was angry at my adoptive mother for initiating the divorce, and subsequently severed ties with me and stopped communicating with me as a way to get revenge on her. And that was just like another blow. Had a lot of like these sort of challenging early life experiences, both sort of economically and socially and emotionally. And later on, sort of skipping through a little bit, but ended up joining the military as a way to just sort of get out of there, get out of all of the chaos that I was sort of ensconced in. And over time, sort of matured and found my path there after I enlisted. Sort of found my interests organically just through sort of picking up books, reading articles, watching lectures on YouTube, things like that. And discovered, this is where my interests lie in sort of behavioral science, psychology, these kinds of things, social science in general. And I went to Yale on the GI Bill, and sort of, that's a long story short.
So you eventually went to Yale, and then you made it to Cambridge, where you're at today. As you were going through these different phases in your life, what were some of the more salient differences that you observed among people in these different segments of society, especially in terms of how they expressed or signaled to each other what they valued and how they communicated with each other?
Yeah, I mean, so when I got to Yale, I came there, I literally had gotten out of the military in August and started school in September. So like, just a couple of weeks later after I separated from the military. I was a little bit older, came from a completely different background. I mean, there was this pretty popular article in the New York Times a couple of years ago, which found, just basically the wealth disparity among students at elite universities. There are more students at places like Yale, more students from the top 1% than the bottom 60%. So it's basically like surrounded by, some of the wealthiest, people from the wealthiest families in the country. I was just sort of curious, like, what are these people like? What are they doing? What are they interested in? And, I ended up coming up with this term, just sort of organically. I was reading a little bit of like Thorstein Veblen's work, the economist and sociologist from the late 19th century, and how he had, sort of observed how the elites of his time displayed their social status through luxury goods, through sort of their material wealth, wearing, tuxedos and evening gowns and taking up these costly hobbies, playing golf, going beagling, having butlers and servants and all these things. And one thing that I noticed right away when I got to Yale that kind of surprised me was how they look like normal college students on the outside. You wouldn't necessarily know just from looking at them that they were students at sort of this rich university, except in the winter. Like at that point, Canada Goose jackets were really popular, and I remember when I looked up the price of Canada Goose jackets, just blew my mind, because like the cost of those, that was like, it's like $800 or $900, which is equivalent to when I first enlisted, that was like a month's paycheck. $900. So I was like just blown away that they would buy this jacket that, wasn't really that much better than like, I don't know, a North Face or something like that. But anyway, but generally speaking, they were kind of like, materially not that different. I noticed, like, just in general, that rich people don't necessarily look wealthier. If you walk down, I took a lot of trips to New York, and if you walk around, you don't always necessarily know just by looking who the rich people are and maybe who the middle class and lower income people are just from looking at them. Whereas if you walked through New York 100 years ago, it was very easy to say, like, that's the rich guy, and that's someone who's not. But there was something different, in the ways that they talked, in their viewpoints about like important social and political issues. The people I interacted with, I had a lot of strange experiences, and over time I came up with this term luxury beliefs, which are ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And adopting sort of unconventional views, these are ways to sort of distance themselves from ordinary people, from middle class people who didn't attend universities, who don't keep up with the fashionable periodicals, and don't listen to podcasts and these kind of things. So these luxury beliefs, we can get into specific examples, but my claim is that nowadays you can predict much more someone's social class from their views on a handful of political or social topics than you can just from what they happen to be wearing or carrying with them at that time.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Before we get into examples and unpack that a little bit more, let's talk about social status more generally. So from your perspective, from a psychologist's perspective, how would you define what social status is? We all have an intuitive notion of it, but let's put a definition to it.
Yes. So there, I mean, even in the psychological research, there's some debate about what social status means. I remember for a while there was like this debate about the difference between social status and power. Power, I think, now is viewed as control of resources, which isn't necessarily the same thing as status. Joseph Henrich and others have defined, they sort of delineated status or broken it down into prestige versus dominance. Sort of prestige is freely conferred status that I sort of give it to you because I admire you, versus dominance, which is, I guess, sort of more associated with power, which is, I defer to you because I'm a little bit afraid of you or something like that. But I think generally, at least the way that I use it, it's respect and admiration from peers. There's this idea of sociometric status. Michael Krauss and others at Yale have used this term in some of their research. So one of their interesting findings, they call it the local ladder effect, but they found that in terms of happiness, a lot of focus is paid to, or attention is focused on income, the relationship between income and low income and happiness. But what they found is that sociometric status, or respect and admiration from peers, is a much stronger predictor of a person's happiness than their socioeconomic status, at least in, the US context, where, generally speaking, even like, really poor people or working class people, they still, very few of them are sort of on the brink of starvation. So once you sort of have that minimal level of material sustenance, then the way that you're looked upon by your peers, that becomes much more important for you in terms of your well-being and your happiness. And so yeah, that's kind of how I would define status.
Interesting. So we all have an intuitive notion of status. Everyone wants to have high status within their local environment. This seems to be baked in, given that we're such highly social primates. What do we know about how far back this goes? Do we see this kind of fixation on social rank in pre-industrial hunter-gatherer tribes and non-human primates?
Yeah, I mean, I recently wrote this long form review of now it's become one of my favorite books, called Hierarchy in the Forest by Christopher Boehm, I think is how you pronounce his last name, Boehm. He's an anthropologist, I think at UCLA. And this book is, he compiled all of this research from anthropologists and psychologists and others, basically looking at the sort of archaeological, anthropological records, and along with observations from modern hunter-gatherer communities in Brazil and Africa, Papua New Guinea, and basically finds consistent patterns that people care a lot about their social rank within their communities. And there's this sort of, I mean, it's interesting. These communities tend to be quite egalitarian, at least among adult male members. But it's not because they love peace so much or like they love equality. It's really this sort of like constant tension and this relentless focus on trying to sort of make sure that you never slip too low and making sure that others never go too high. And BAME offers some examples from like hunting troops among hunter-gatherer communities, and how these anthropologists will speak to them, and how they'll have these practices where if a hunter happens to take down a large animal, immediately all of his peers start making fun of him and tell him how the animal actually wasn't that big, and how that actually wasn't such a skillful throw, and how when you were running, you looked like a little bit funny when you were running, and immediately start cutting him down. And the reason for this is that they don't want the skillful hunters to get big heads. They don't want them to become arrogant, because I guess this idea is that once they become too arrogant, then they will start to exercise dominance over their peers, perhaps try to monopolize more resources, or try to take another man's wife. And so there's this sort of tacit kind of cooperative idea here, where everyone is trying to check everyone else. And of course, like, among chimpanzees, you see a lot of battles for rank, social dominance there as well. And it's much more overt among a lot of the primates, non-human apes. So, and then across like human societies, we see this as well. One of the things that interested me, to kind of go back to your earlier question, was the finding that, and this has been found in a couple of different studies now, that in the US, that interest in obtaining status is correlated with current social status. So in other words, the higher status you happen to be in terms of sort of income, occupational prestige, and so on, the more interested those people tend to be in either preserving or enhancing their status, which to me, that was a little bit counterintuitive, because I guess I would have predicted in advance maybe the people who are sort of at the bottom, who maybe don't have much status, don't have much influence or wealth, that those would be the people most interested in sort of obtaining it and gaining more of it. But it's actually the people at the top who are most interested in social status, which I think, like, for me, that put a lot of puzzle pieces into place based on sort of the anxiety that I saw among sort of top college students and top graduates.
Yeah, that's interesting tie into the whole mental health thing, because I don't know the exact numbers right now, but I know that generally speaking, at colleges, including or even especially the elite colleges, levels of anxiety and depression have been going up quite a bit over the last few years. And it's one of those things that's perhaps a bit counterintuitive, because you're talking about a population that has or seems to have all of the things one would think satisfy the needs as people that we have, such that we don't need to be anxious or depressed. You're at a top college, you're getting an education, you're materially better than most people, and yet we're seeing this increase in anxiety. So can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, so yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting. I mean, it matches my observations too. And there's a lot of research on this as well, that among both undergrads and grad students, PhD students, yeah, the rates of anxiety and depression are on the rise. I just saw this. It was reported in the New York Times, these findings from I think it was a team of researchers at Yale, actually, finding that in the past, sort of lower income adolescents reported higher rates of anxiety and depression, which to me, of course, that makes sense. If you're lower income, you just experience more challenges in your daily life. But I think starting in the 90s, it reversed to where affluent adolescents from sort of middle and upper middle class homes reported higher rates of depression, anxiety, drug use, all these kinds of harmful or risky behaviors. And yeah, I was thinking about what this could possibly, what reasons there could be for this. Why was there this reversal? And I think one possibility goes back to sort of what I was saying in the beginning. I think in the past, lower income meant like more, like it was more serious, the kind of deprivation that people experienced up until fairly recently. Perhaps because of like, sort of state benefits and all these kinds of things. Maybe stepped in and helped a little bit. But in the past, if you were poor in poverty, like that was serious. Like maybe you actually couldn't eat that day. But once you reach that level of now if you're lower income in the US, you still are not quite as poor as someone maybe 50 or 60 years ago in your sort of, income decile or something. And so for them, like now that they've met that level, now they don't have to worry as much about material deprivation. And in this case, for them, yeah, maybe they don't have that same pressure. Whereas for the upper class, I think there was like back when, a lot of people complain about the meritocracy, but I think that in decades past, when the social classes were more isolated and there was less permeability between them, when, if you were an upper class person, like if you went to Harvard, say, odds are you came from a well-to-do family, like you're going to do okay no matter what, like you're sort of locked into your social status. Whereas today, like there's more permeability. You can rise and fall a little bit more, I think. Also, like in the past, if you were born to the right family and went to the right school, I think that was enough to some degree back then. Whereas now that's like, that gets your foot in the door, right? Like getting the right degree. And so there seems to be much more pressure among young people as well, that just because you get into a good college, that doesn't necessarily mean you're set, because all of your peers are bright and ambitious too. And so they're all interested in getting the right internships, getting into the right law schools and so on. I mean, maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but one of the things that I saw that was kind of funny, it confused me at first at Yale, was I would see students sort of saying things like investment banks were emblematic of capitalist depression. Same with consultancies too, and sort of listing all of the reasons why you should never work at one of these evil corporations or companies. And then weeks later, I would see those same exact students at a recruitment session for Goldman Sachs. Mm-hmm. And after a couple of instances of that, of seeing that, I was, I would wonder, like, why are they doing this? Like, why would on the one hand you would say like, oh, it's evil to work here, but then you're trying to get a job there. Mm-hmm. Over time, my interpretation of this is that they were trying to undercut their competitors. I think like it's so cutthroat to get a position like that. So, yeah.
I mean, a lot of these ideas that you've been articulating and then I've read from you, they remind me, they make a lot of sense of things in retrospect from my college days. So this is probably similar to your observations at Yale. I went to college at the University of Wisconsin, and I pretty much immediately went into what you would call the mechanistic sciences. So I was taking what the average student would probably call fairly difficult courses that most people choose not to take unless they are weird like me, or you're really into, science. And I was a first generation college student, and I struggled to pay for college. So like every semester I was always late. I was always like trying to deal with that before like actually dealing with my courses and my academic responsibilities. That partly I think blinded me to noticing some of the other stuff that was going around me. But one of the things that was very apparent on day one is I got to the campus in Madison, Wisconsin, and you could see, but people would also just tell you, they would talk about the fact that there were two classes of students at the University of Wisconsin. One was called the Townies and the other were called the Coasties. And a Townie referred to someone who was typically a Wisconsin native, meaning they were paying in-state tuition, they were local, they were from the surrounding culture, et cetera, et cetera. A Coastie was someone who was typically from the East or the West Coast. They were paying out-of-state tuition, and that was not a big deal for them because they came from a wealthy family, and they dressed different, they talked different, they looked different. And I sort of didn't pay attention to that, but one thing I did notice was that on average, it was quite clear that the ratio of those two types of people would be different depending on the type of course you were in. So for example, there were a couple of cases where I took classes either by mistake because I thought they satisfied a requirement, or because I had to take them for degree reasons, even though they were outside of my interest areas. So I would take, say, a communications class or a sociology class or something like that I didn't necessarily want to take but had to. And I would notice that the ratio was quite different. You would get a lot more students in those courses who were from the coasts, who were wealthier, who had some of the visible signals of that, and who also behaved differently in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I would see many fewer of them in, an organic chemistry course or something like that. And I never really wrapped my head around it, but, the courses where I would see more of these people from the coasts or in that class of student, they were much easier courses. I remember sitting in these classes and being like ready to go. And then like after the first few weeks, I'm like, wow, this is completely effortless. I don't have to actually do anything except show up to class and I will get an A in this class. But I always wondered if the students taking those types of courses more were much more focused on fighting battles of status. Really, I didn't really think of it this way inside their social circles, because I did notice that there was kind of this almost viciousness to becoming popular in those types of circles that wasn't apparent in the other class of students. And it really seems to echo some of the things you were talking about.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, now you have me wondering, I entered Yale at an unusual time. It was basically right when the student protests erupted as a result of an email one of the faculty members sent to her students. Basically, the charges were that she was defending cultural appropriation and all these kinds of things. And I remember, I had this really tense interaction with a young woman, this female student, and I was basically just trying to say, like, I have no idea why people are so upset. I read that email, I just didn't get it. I had come from a completely different world, and so trying to understand like what it was that was so offensive about what this faculty member had said was just confusing to me. And this young woman just said that I was too privileged to understand why people were so upset. Later, I found out that this person, grew up in Greenwich, which is like one of the wealthiest zip codes in the country. Went to Exeter, yeah. So it was just a strange thing to be called privileged by someone like that. But I'm wondering, like, are a lot of these people who played these hardcore status games, are they more likely to say have a parent who went to college, who come from sort of the upper middle or upper class, whereas the people just sort of anecdotally, the people I remember who were kind of either confused or questioning a lot of the activism that was going on campus and calls for professors to be fired, a lot of them were kind of either first generation students or, children of immigrants, or just people who didn't necessarily, come from places like Greenwich and didn't go to private school. But so I think there might be something to that as well. And maybe, if you compare, say, the level of status games and that kind of thing at, I don't know, places like maybe MIT or Caltech versus, Harvard or Yale or something, I'll bet there would be some differences, even though I would imagine that, the caliber of students are roughly the same, or perhaps even better at these sort of more STEM oriented schools. And so, yeah, I think there is something there too. It's funny, the term you use, townies versus coasties. So I've heard this term used here at Cambridge. So now I'm over here in England, and like the class stuff here is just way more complex. I don't even try to examine it because it's much older and more layers to it. But one thing that I learned here was they have this distinction between town versus gown. So the town, or the townies, I guess, are the people who live in Cambridge, who sort of work here and operate the businesses and so on, who grew up here. And then the gowns, I guess I don't know if they call them gownies, but the gown types are like the students and people associated with the university, the scholars and so on. And I guess there is this sort of historical tension both here at Cambridge and over at Oxford as well. And yeah, I noticed that there isn't that much focus paid to the people who live here. I saw this at Yale as well. New Haven, which is where Yale is located, is an extremely poor town, a lot of poverty, a lot of mental illness, homelessness, addiction. I lived downtown in New Haven. So to get to class and back, I would walk through like a lot of poverty. And I just remember having experiences like I'd go to Yale and I'd hear people talk about the importance of activism and all of these kinds of things, social justice. And then like I'd walk through, a lot of homelessness and addiction and all this stuff. And I would think to myself, like, I don't know how serious these people really are. Like, there just seems to be this duplicity to it that it really, I have no doubt that some of them are sincere, but I think a good portion of them are also mouthing the right words because it helps them boost their status in their local environment. I mean, there are certain words you can say that will instantly garner approval. Yeah.
The last thing I want to say here before we move on, because I think we'll kind of loop back to this in a couple different ways, is, at the University of Wisconsin, there was these really two different castes of people almost, not necessarily one above the other, but I think the important observation is there was no overt segregation. There was only self-segregation. by and large, right, the one group would hang out with the one group and the other group would hang out with the other group. And that was by choice. And so all of the social competition, therefore, was sort of within group. And I'm interested in this idea of sort of within group or within class competition, because I think a lot of the things that you're talking about or that we observe in this general area result not from people trying to compete or display superiority to those in sort of a lower caste, but actually competing with those that are approximately equal to them in status. And I think we'll come back to that. But you've been talking about high status or elite individuals. You've mentioned that a couple times. Again, we have an intuitive notion of what this might mean, but what would be the key determining factors that make someone high status or elite in society? You've already told us it's not strictly determined by wealth.
Yeah, I mean, so this is also sort of a contentious debate. I mean, I was reading a little bit of the sociological research on this as well about, there are discussions and debates between like status versus class. Like, is there a difference between social status versus social class and all these things? I mean, so the very first like book that I read about class in America, and like this is sort of like where like the way I tend to define it comes from Paul Fussel's book called Class: A Guide to the American Status System. I think it was written in like 1981 or something. I mean, it's an incredible book. It's like a little bit tongue in cheek, but it is like a very useful book, I think, to understand class. Some of the things are outdated, but generally the way that he describes it is that, for the lower class, they tend to define class strictly in terms of money or wealth. The more money you have, the higher class you are. And I kind of observed this too when I was growing up. I remember, I worked at this pizza joint when I was in high school washing dishes, and I would talk with my coworkers about, striking it rich. It was all about money. It was never about like, I can't wait to get into college and get a good education or something like that. Other things associated with class. It was really about money. Playing the lottery. A lot of my coworkers played the lottery. My family, some of them played the lottery too. And really the interest was on like, how do I get a bigger bank account? How do I buy a boat or a nicer car, material goods? And then Fussell says for the middle class, it's more about education. So sort of the rank of your college or, what you studied, did you sort of stay in your local area or did you go away to college? Those are sort of markers of status too. Which I guess like when you go away, that's sort of an indicator of how much money your parents have. But anyway, so that's the middle class, is sort of education. And then for the upper class, it's not just money and education. Those things are important. But the final ingredient is your sort of habitus, your taste, your habits, your preferences, the kinds of media you consume, the kinds of books you read. I guess today, to update it would be, which podcasts you listen to, what are the periodicals you read, your digital subscriptions, which, I guess maybe now which Substacks you read, something like that. So those three ingredients are important. And what's interesting is that one of Fussell's claims is that you are sort of locked in to the class you were born into. So no matter what, you are the class you happen to be born into. So I guess like for Fussell, someone like Mark Zuckerberg, I think he was born into like an upper middle class family. I think his parents were professionals, but they weren't like exorbitantly rich. So even though Mark Zuckerberg is, a gazillionaire, he is sort of culturally will forever be upper middle class. Whereas someone who was, born as like a Rockefeller or a Kennedy or something, I don't know, like one of these sort of dynasty waspy families or something, even if they aren't as rich as their great grandfather was or something, and maybe the family sort of on a downward trajectory in terms of their social mobility, they're still sort of upper class in terms of their habits and tastes and so on, and the kinds of things that they do. So that's another interesting element of this as well, is that there is like economic mobility. You can start off poor and maybe go to college and get a high paying job and so on. And so you're economically upwardly mobile, but sort of socially and culturally, you can't really break out of whatever you're born into. At least this is the claim of Fussell and some others.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, though, behaviorally, right? A lot of behaviors and habits that we learn at a very young age really do get locked in, down to the way that we talk and, pronounce phonemes and things like this. It's very, very difficult to shake the way that you talk and the way that you express language after you go through puberty, basically. So it makes perfect sense to me that would be the case. And this is probably related to the entire reason why we have terms like old money and new money. If you come into money, you still have these sort of habits and behaviors that are effectively locked in because it's so difficult to unlearn them, or at least make them second nature in the way that the other behaviors would be for someone born into it.
Right. Yeah, like you said, like, yeah, the way that people talk, the kinds of like the foods that they like to eat, the music they like to listen to, a lot of the like the sort of the cultural norms are hidden too. So if you didn't grow up around them, you don't necessarily know like the proper way to navigate them. And in some cases, they may even be deliberately hidden in order to sort of filter out like who's an insider and who's an outsider. I remember I read this this interview. It was in the Atlantic with these two sociologists discussing class, and they gave this example of a lot of workplaces no longer have dress codes, and it's sort of seen ostensibly as this egalitarian sort of upgrade of like, in the past, you had to wear these clothes, but now you can wear whatever you want, and it's sort of freeing. But actually, one of the points that these two sociologists made, their names escape me, but it was basically that the norms still exist, they just went underground, and now people are able to pinpoint like who can pick up on what those covert norms are and who can't. And this is another way of creating sort of insiders versus outsiders. Whereas if you have overt and clear dress codes, then anyone can fit in, right? Like if you have to wear a suit and tie, you get the suit and tie and you can fit in. But now you don't know like what's the right way to dress casually. They give this example of they were talking about a media company, I think, or sort of like television studios or something, and they said that there was no dress code. And there was this guy who worked there who came from a working class family. He was this black guy who would, I think he wore like a tracksuit or something. And, I guess like people there, like they had, they didn't like that, but they never told him. And over time, like the guy just left, and he left, he left the job because even though the dress code was casual or no dress code, he didn't dress casually in the right way and ended up, not really fitting in. And I think like there are a lot of instances of this, of like, we try to be more egalitarian, but we end up, it ends up sort of backfiring in some ways because, back to our earlier, point that status is always sort of pervasive. And if you try to get rid of it, it will sort of manifest in a different way.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this idea that a lot of the taboos we enforce are organic and they're covert. And I wonder if that's a feature that is sort of naturally baked in. One of the things this reminds me of is people's perception, or at least what people will say their own status is. I'm thinking here of the statistics where, you ask, and this is Americans, you ask Americans, are you lower class, middle class, or upper class? And some extraordinarily high percentage of them say middle class. So the majority of the people that are actually upper class or lower class identify as middle class, together with all of the people that are middle class. So there's this tendency for everyone to be seen as, just like everyone else, even though we all know that that's not the case for everyone. So is there something interesting going on there with what people behaviorally display? I mean, in terms of their other behaviors versus what they will explicitly identify as?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen those stats as well, that like, somehow every American, whether you make, 30 grand or 300 grand, you're a middle class person. I saw a lot of this in undergrad too. Like that was the first time that someone could tell me, oh, my mother is a doctor and my father's a lawyer, and we may make $1 million a year, but we're sort of like middle, or something like that, middle class, maybe upper middle class. And that just blew my mind to hear that you could make six figures and consider yourself a middle class person. I mean, even if you make 100 grand, I think that's twice as much as like the median household income in America. And yeah, I mean, a lot of that is, I think, sort of you're comparing yourself to your peers, right? So if you're making 100 grand a year, you're not comparing yourself to the median American. You're comparing yourself to your friends who are in the sort of same social category as you, same education level, the people you graduated high school with or college with or something like that. And I think there's also like this element of upward social comparison. So this is, sort of findings from social psychology that, people tend not to really think too much about the people below them, and they spend a lot of time preoccupied with those above them. So even if you're an upper middle class person doing well in your life, you're not comparing yourself to, people who are living in poverty or people who are just sort of getting by. You're comparing yourself to the people who are a little above you. You're comparing yourself to the millionaires. And if you're a millionaire, you're comparing yourself to the billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically everyone except the billionaires think of themselves as middle class. Go on. Yeah.
Oh, I think there's actually this, it strikes me. So when we're talking about intraclass competition and this positive correlation between how high your status currently is and how much you want more status and some of the things you're just mentioning, it actually starts to make sense to me when I think about two things. One, just the statistics of a normal distribution, and two, something like Dunbar's number. This idea that, even though we live in this hyper-connected world, we're still these social primates that think in terms of, the size of hunter-gatherer tribes. So you can only know the names of something like 150 people-ish, and you're really only going to have close relationships with, say, 15 people, whatever it is, but, a relatively small number. And so if you think in socioeconomic terms, and you just look at the normal or normal-ish distribution of incomes, as your income goes up, it obviously goes up, but also the variance of the bell curve also goes up. So if you're comparing yourself to the 15 people closest to you, as your income goes up, the difference between you and those 15 people will also necessarily go up. And so you can see how it leads to this runaway effect where you become more and more obsessed with how you're stacking up relative to the people next to you. And naturally, of course, you're going to want to ascend, not descend.
That's fascinating, actually. Okay, so the idea here is that, like, if you're, sort of a, working class person, the close 15 people, there's not going to be that much range. If you make, $25,000 a year, the richest person in your group might make, $37,000 or something like that. But if you're in the very top and you make 200,000, your best friend in that 15 person group might make, several million. And so even though all of you are well off and so on, that's fascinating. Yeah, I can imagine that there is like that sort of amplifies or cultivates more and more status anxiety among the upper class too, or the upper middle and the upper class, that they're constantly feeling like they're falling behind because the higher up they go, the sort of richer their social circle becomes, something like that. That makes a lot of sense to me too. Well, and I think there's also sort of a selection effect too going on where a lot of the top universities are selecting for people who are interested in status. I mean, just to begin with, if you're going to apply to a top university, whether for undergrad or grad school, you are the kind of person who's sort of, at least somewhat interested in things like prestige and status and respect and those kinds of things. And so you're already sort of conditioning on that as well. And so, and then those kinds of people are then surrounded by those just like them. And you can constantly feel that sense of like falling more and more behind. And I think it's not just money though. Like, I'm thinking about like sort of social habits as well. I was talking to a friend of mine who was saying that, his friend had read the, this sort of widely cited statistic, something like 40 to 50% of marriages end in divorce. And then he said, I'm looking at like my entire social circle, a bunch of guys in their 30s, and none of us are divorced. And, some of us have been married for 10 years. There's no divorces. So I don't know like how this stat exists. And, my friend told him look, like if you break it down by education, then it's a completely different story. Like basically all of us have postgraduate degrees, and among people with postgrad degrees, no one gets divorced. It is like extremely rare for that to happen. So I think like, often when you look at the sort of overall averages, it can obscure some of the nuances in terms of social class or education or those kinds of things too. And you can live in like a completely different world just by sort of what social class you happen to be in, not just economically, but sort of socioculturally as well.
Mm-hmm. Before we circle back to luxury beliefs, let's just talk about luxury goods as a transition into that. We all, again, probably have an intuitive notion of what a luxury good is, but I'm wondering if you can comment on the fact that, let's talk about clothing, for example. There's an entire spectrum of clothing out there, and some of it's more expensive and trendier, and some of it's less. Can you talk about the phenomenon that we'll all be familiar with, that, fashion trends are constantly changing and turning over? What's actually driving the change in trends in fashion, say?
Yeah. I mean, well, my understanding of this is that, basically there's like this sort of the trend setting group, the sort of, I forgot the term for this, but basically this small group of people who kind of wear something unusual or unique. And then it sort of trickles throughout the upper class. And then over time, it sort of trickles downward to the rest of the social classes who adopt this look as it becomes more and more affordable. I mean, like even things like, to bring back the Canada Goose example, like now you're seeing, because you can buy these jackets secondhand, or, people are borrowing them or giving them away, like they've sort of diluted their value somewhat. So in 2015, those were the hottest thing you could wear in the winter, at least in New England. And now they're kind of like, they're not that fancy anymore. When Ivy League students were wearing them, they were really special, but now anyone can get them. And, now they're not such a hot ticket item. So I think there's this sort of element of like, they're the trendsetters. They establish something that's cool, and then other people adopt the look. And then over time, it sort of trickles through, and sort of the new cycle starts with whatever the next item happens to be. I think this is like, a lot of things are like this, iPods too. I remember for when iPods first came out, those things were like, they were super expensive. Only like rich people could have them. There were like a couple of rich kids that I knew who had them. And then, over time, like once they become more affordable and like the newer models came out and you can afford an older model. And now like having an iPod is like nothing. Or an iPhone or whatever happens to be. So all of these things sort of have these life cycles in that sense for luxury goods and for fashion. And I think luxury beliefs work in similar ways.
Can you provide now some clear examples of things that you think are good examples of luxury beliefs that you've observed?
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote an essay. The very first one I wrote about luxury beliefs. It was this example. I had this conversation with a former classmate of mine. She told me that she told me that monogamy was outdated and that marriage is kind of this passé thing, and that, maybe we should move beyond it. And I was like, okay, that's an unusual belief. These are things that I didn't really hear in the military, things that I didn't hear growing up, but not uncommon to hear among graduates of places like Yale. And so I asked her, like, but what do you plan to do? Like, first I asked her, well, what was your family like? Did you come from that kind of family of like, I don't know, open marriage or polygamy or something? And she said, no, I was raised by, mom and a dad. And then I asked her, well, what do you plan to do? Are you planning to live, sort of that kind of open marriage or not get married? And she said, well, no, eventually I'd like to, find someone and settle down and have a family. I want to get married, but it shouldn't have to be for everyone. And I noticed that like this kind of belief was pervasive among a lot of kind of highly educated people, that they espouse like one set of views, but then the way that they actually live their own lives is sort of completely different. They're almost like living the opposite of what they say. I heard this interesting phrase. A lot of affluent people, they walk the 50s and talk the 60s, and so I think this idea that all family structures are exactly the same, and that monogamy or marriage is outdated. That's one example of this, because if you look at who actually gets married and who stays married and doesn't get divorced, it's disproportionately highly educated people. Like the example with my friend that I gave earlier. Whereas if you look at working class and more lower income people, the marriage rates are low. And then of those who do get married, the divorce rates are much higher. Single parenthood is very high. When I look at the family structures of the way that I grew up, and then all of my best friends from high school, literally none of us were raised in sort of stable 2-parent homes. Friends who were raised by grandmothers, or like a single mom or a step parent or something like that, or foster homes. And the friends that I made through college and here at Cambridge, like those kinds of family structures are just unheard of. Everyone lived with 2 parents. So that's one. I think there are a couple of others, but I think that one to me was that was like the light bulb moment, because it reminded me of this other experience that I had in a class where the professor asked all of the students, how many of you were raised by both of your birth parents? And out of 20 something students, it was just me and one other student who said that we were not. It was an anonymous survey, so I know it was just me and someone else in that classroom said that they were raised in a different kind of family structure. And that was actually the first time that I realized that something was different in terms of the way that people grew up versus, the way that my peers at college grew up versus my peers, say, in high school. There was something completely different, not just in terms of economics, in terms of how much money we had, which was like clearly like there was a difference there, but then also like more subtly, the family structures that we came from, the kinds of beliefs, the importance of education. This emphasis on education, it's kind of different too. Like, broadly speaking, I noticed that highly educated people love talking about the importance of education and how we need to get more poor kids into college. But then when I give specific examples, like the attitude tends to change. I had this conversation with the student here at Cambridge about a friend of mine in high school. This guy, he could have been recruited to play football school in California, I think Sacramento State. And I remember he was failing a class, and all he had to do was attend this makeup course over spring break. 2-week course. If he just showed up to class and I think got a B, then it would have like kept his GPA at the right level, and he could have been recruited to play football in college. He went for like the first 2 days, and then we spent the rest of spring break just like getting drunk and screwing around, and like we just got in a lot of trouble. And at the time, like I didn't care, he didn't care. But looking back, I realized like, what were his parents doing? Like, why didn't they make sure that he was like, on track to go to college? I told my friend here at Cambridge about this, and she said like, yeah, but like, maybe he wasn't meant to go, if like that's what he wanted to do, if that's what he was interested in, and, maybe he just didn't want to go to college. Like, maybe that's okay. Like this sort of sympathetic, non-judgmental attitude. And then I asked her, well, like, what if that was your son? Like, what if your son was like, all he had to do was sit in a desk for 2 weeks and he could go to college? Like, what would you do? And she said like, oh, I would make sure he was in that desk, or I would threaten to kill him if he didn't go to class.
Yeah, she immediately goes from everyone can do what they want to basically fascism.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like this totally free for all, like, oh, it's okay. People can do what they want. We shouldn't force anyone. But when it's her kid, it's suddenly. And so I think there's this like for everyone else, I adopt this non-judgmental, you shouldn't get married, you shouldn't go to class, you can do whatever you want. But then when it comes to my family and the people that I care the most about, the standards are much more strict. So I think these are just like a couple of examples, but the underlying principle here, I think, is this sort of non-judgmental attitude for others. And then for me, it's, much more strict, but there are others too. I mean, we can get into like, the craziness of like defund the police and all this stuff. Like there are a lot of like luxury beliefs popping up.
Yeah. What's your take on that? And so let's have you talk about that luxury belief as you see it. And then I'm wondering if you can comment on, if you're right, if these are luxury beliefs analogous to luxury goods that are fashionable and go in cycles, that would predict that these luxury beliefs will cycle in and out as well, meaning the ones that we see today will go away at some point, probably not that too far into the future, and new ones will replace them.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the defund the police thing, I mean, when that started kicking off, I was like just totally shocked by it at first. And, but then like, I'm like, oh, it's Twitter. It's like, people who spend a lot of time on Twitter tend to be sort of affluent, highly educated people, just statistically speaking. I mean, Pew recently came out with some data on this, that they're much more likely to have a college degree and earn, a certain level of income. But then I wondered like, what about people, if you break it down by income, are there differences in support for this defund the police idea? And fortunately, YouGov shared some data on this. I had to do a little bit of digging, but I found it. And basically the group that is most in support of defund the police are people in the highest income category. Something like 33 or 35%, versus the other income categories, it's like 20% or something like that lower. So generally speaking, the people who have the most money are most in support of defunding the police. And of course, like this to me is like the definition of a luxury belief. This is an opinion that confers status on the upper class, but will inflict costs on lower classes. If you say defund the police, it makes you look good to your highly educated and affluent peers. It makes you look, I don't know, edgy or progressive or something. But if you literally get rid of the police, if you eliminate the police, then the people who suffer the most are going to be poor people. The poor are already disproportionately the targets of all kinds of crimes. I mean, it's interesting. We spend a lot of time focusing on how poverty can sort of give rise to criminal behavior. If someone grows up poor, maybe they're more likely to commit criminal acts. but who are those acts committed against? Disproportionately against people in their neighborhood, other poor people. And, it's interesting. We have these categories of, rich, middle class, and poor. But then if you sort of look at it in a more sort of granular level, the people who tend to commit crimes are young men, and the targets of crimes tend to be the elderly and tend to be women. So it's sort of like, do we care about poor elderly people? Do we care about poor women? Those are the targets of crimes. I looked at some data, I think this is from the FBI, that the people in the lowest income category compared to the highest, there's something like 7 times more likely to be victims of aggravated assault and robbery, 20 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault. Like, basically, if you're a poor person, the likelihood that you're going to be a victim of a crime is like astronomical compared to sort of middle and upper class people. And when we talk about like defunding the police, it's just like, I guess that totally gets glossed over. And then, of course, like if you look at communities and you see that like, most like non-white people are in favor of either the current level of police or more policing. I think defund the police is just a classic example of this. There's like a more so yeah, and then to your point, like this I'm not sure will actually trickle down, because like it's so costly, I think, to not have police, that I'm not really sure that this is going to become like a fashionable belief. At least, we'll see.
Well,
I'm
I mean,
skeptical of this one.
In my observation, I think it can certainly trickle, one step down, but not all the way down.
Mm-hmm. One step meaning like
upper middle class. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's certainly been my observation, at least living in a cosmopolitan area. Mm-hmm. But
where are you?
I'm in Seattle.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's like, I don't think we need to get into it too much, but yeah, Seattle, you've got a very huge spectrum of people. You definitely see that belief on people who are higher status, socioeconomically speaking. But it's not reserved solely for the upper quintile, in my observation. But you're not really seeing any of the homeless people at these rallies. They're too busy living their life on the street, struggling day to day. But I wonder if some of these beliefs will cycle. That does seem to be a prediction. If I call what you're talking about your theory, I think that would be a prediction of it, right? That the luxury beliefs would have to change because they are a mechanism for actually displaying your difference from other people.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is something that I guess there's some nuance here. Like, on the one hand, you want to like if you're an upper class person who is displaying your status through luxury beliefs, you want to distinguish yourself from the little people, from people who are not in your same social class. You don't want to be mistaken from like a middle class or working class person. But there's also something going on like sort of this intraclass status signaling too, like you had mentioned before. So I think within the upper class, the sort of trendsetters within that group, they say defund the police, and then it sort of trickles to like the more sort of conventional upper middle class, the sort of suits or whatever, the kind of people who work 9 to 5s or something. Once executives and lawyers start saying defund the police, then the sort of the trendsetters and the fashionable types, now that they see that the suits are broadcasting that slogan, then it's like, okay, well, now I have to distinguish myself as a trendsetter. So it doesn't necessarily, I think, have to trickle all the way down to the middle and lower classes. Once it trickles throughout that sort of upper quintile, say, or the upper 2 quintiles, then you can sort of shift into a different shift over to a different belief. So it's interesting, right? Like there is this sort of like, on the one hand, does it trickle down throughout the classes, or does it trickle throughout like within that class? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I'm struck by, so these beliefs that you're calling luxury beliefs, they tend to have a moralistic character to them. So not only are you taking a stance or making an observation on the way society is, or perhaps should be, but there's this sort of extra step where, to believe it is to be better or righteous, and to not believe it is actually to make you lesser. And in some sense, what you're telling us is this might be even more literal than you might otherwise think. And it strikes me that it has this moralistic character to it. It reminded me of something that you posted at some point recently that I saw, and it was something from the sociologist Emil Durkheim. And he kind of did this thought experiment where he gave his take on what it would be like if we somehow were to eradicate all crime and bad behavior in society. So he actually said that something interesting would happen in his view if we did that. And I'm wondering if you remember that.
Yeah, I do. Durkheim was sort of this sociologist, I think from the 19th century, sort of this old school sociologist. And the idea here is that, the thought experiment was once you sort of eliminate all transgressions and say that anything goes, very quickly new taboos would arise. So basically, like once, as behaviors become more and more accepted, the level of sort of moralism within the community remains the same. Just new behaviors become considered evil or bad or transgressive in some way. And yeah, to me, this is, I think he even gave a couple of examples about like, even at like a monastery or something where, everyone is sort of adhering to these codes. They still have like certain things that you're not allowed to do, or certain kinds of misbehaviors that they condemn. So yeah, I think that there is something here with the luxury beliefs as well. This actually connects a little bit with my own research. This is just a hypothesis that I have, which is that if you look at, so I've looked at some sort of big data from the World Value Survey and others, basically finding that young people have become much more permissive over time for kind of conventional moral transgressions. So things like bribery and corruption and theft and these kinds of things, young people, even after controlling for education, income, and political orientation, young people are still more permissive in 2020 relative to 1990 and 1970. And so on the one hand, it's kind of interesting that like we're kind of like more non-judgmental, more permissive, whatever, more cool about all this stuff. But on the other hand, you're seeing like a lot of strident moralism today among young people with sort of activism and social justice movements and so on. And one of my claims here is that like this kind of connects to this Durkheimian idea that now that we have sort of allowed all these behaviors to proliferate, we're not judging them anymore, we're not condemning them. That void has been filled, and it's been filled with these kind of new transgressions about what you say and what you post online, and all of these other kinds of things are the kinds of things that you support, your political views, your social views. If you hold the wrong views about various things, now we're going to condemn you. So I think in this case, this is a way for people to gain status by condemning others and bolstering themselves. And there is some psychology research on this too, that we tend to view people who sort of morally grandstand as being somehow more righteous in some way, because the implicit message here is that if I condemn you for doing something bad, I guess the onlookers think, well, I would never do that, otherwise I wouldn't condemn you. So somehow by condemning you, that makes me look good. And so there is that element. And then I think there's also this element, not only of them trying to like lift themselves up, but they're trying to cut down their rivals as well. They're trying to cut other people down by coming up with these new kinds of transgressions that didn't necessarily exist even a few years ago. Like what's crazy to me is that like now you can even go through someone's feed, and like if I find a tweet that you posted from 2009, somehow, even though in 2009 that tweet was fine, I can cancel you today. That kind of thing is kind of interesting from a sort of psychological perspective.
Yeah, we are seeing that more, and it is fascinating. But I'm interested in this idea that these are basically tools. These are like cultural weapons used primarily to compete against people that you view as competitors, and so that speaks a little bit to the intra-class conflicts that we've been talking about. Are you familiar with Peter Turchin's idea of elite overproduction and how that relates to the decline or instability of civilizations?
Yeah, I've read, I think I read that piece in The Atlantic, was it last year? And yeah, I read a little bit of his blog about this elite overproduction and sort of the intra-elite conflict stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, so the basic idea is, so Peter Turchin is I guess you would say like scientific historian or something. So he's from like quantitative ecology or some field like that, but he's trying to understand in a more quantitative and somewhat even predictive way cycles that happen in history. And, one thing that you can observe over and over again in history is civilizations rise, they do their thing for some amount of time, and they eventually decline, right? So you can think of ancient Rome or any other ancient civilization that we might name. And according to Turchin, as I understand him, a key factor in destabilizing societies when they're on the decline comes from, at least in part, elite overproduction. And what he means by that is when society makes too many potential elites, but there are not enough slots in the power structure, meaning high paying jobs or high status, culturally influential jobs, there are more people who feel entitled or that they should be an elite in such a position than there are actual positions. And so this leads to a like runaway intensification of competition among those elite or elite adjacent people for those limited number of slots. And they basically go to war with each other, and that leads to cultural instability.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I read a couple of chapters now. This is bringing back some of the things. So I read like, I think it was War and Peace and War where he discusses this. I think I specifically just read those chapters because I found it particularly interesting. And I've heard others sort of riff on this idea too. Wesley Yang, the journalist, and others, they refer to what we have today as the sort of Twitter class, the overeducated precariat of like, people with advanced degrees or people from fancy universities, but they're not making money commensurate with, their education level, at least like as they believe that they should be earning, their sort of expectations were higher than whatever the outcome happened to be. I think there is some truth to this. I remember, for example, something about how like the number of households that are worth $10 million or more has increased by like some like substantial amount since the 1980s, adjusted for inflation. But, of course, like all of the influential positions in government, like the number of senators and congressmen, representatives and the president, of course, like those are all fixed. The number of positions at elite media organs and universities are all fixed. I mean, like, so of course, I'm a PhD student. I think, are you a PhD student or you've graduated, right?
I graduated a number of years ago.
Okay. So you've probably heard like, all of the jokes about how hard it is to get an academic position and how they're
not just jokes either. It's true.
Right. Yeah. I think like it's framed as a joke just to help cope with how dire it is. Yeah. But it is like, I hear from young grad students, I talk to, they say like, when my supervisor was my age, 30 odd years ago or whatever it was, you could write 2 papers. If you get 2 published papers, then you can get like a pretty good academic post somewhere, like a tenure track job, 2 or 3 papers. Today, that might get you that might make you competitive for a postdoc. The sort of like PhD glut. More and more people are getting degrees, but the number of faculty positions has remained the same. I mean, which I guess like maybe there's like a conspiratorial element here of like, this is why we're constantly saying more people should go to college because, a lot of highly educated people are hoping to get jobs at whatever the universities happen to open up or whatever. And I think there is like something going on here where, actually, I just read this article too about how there was this influencer. I don't remember her name, but she got a job as like a sports journalist, like completely on the strength of like the number of Instagram followers she had. And apparently like this started like this sort of social media firestorm because all of these people were commenting and attacking her, saying like, why did I go to Columbia Journalism School? I should have just gone on Instagram and gotten some followers or something like that. Like basically the people who followed the sort of preordained expected path of, go to college, go to grad school. This is how you get into journalism. And then like some random person who I don't even know if she went to college at all gets a bunch of Instagram followers and bypasses, just jumps the line and gets this sort of prestigious position. And I think this is sort of indicative of that intra-elite competition idea of like just a lot of bitterness and a lot of anger, I think, among educated people.
Yeah. And I mean, it really is true. Like if you think about politics at the highest level, there are truly, in many cases, a literally fixed number of spots. Like we've had 100 senators since the inception of the Senate, and it's never gone up. When you think about academia, I would say the number, I don't know the exact numbers, but the number of tenure track professorships has gone up marginally. It's gone up much slower than the number of people seeking those positions. And when you think about something like college education, everyone is now expected to get this. And what that coupon allows you to get is much less than it used to be. And people do really treat it as a coupon. Once you have that piece of paper, your expectation as a holder of it is that you can simply exchange it for whatever you perceive to be a good or influential position in society. And that's the dynamics there are fascinating. And even when you think about social media, in some sense, Twitter and the internet and Facebook and all of these things, they allow you to have maximum reach. But when you study these things, we all know that it's dominated by Pareto distributions. It's not everyone's going to become a social media influencer with 1 million Instagram followers. It's going to be a tiny sliver of people. So there's this sort of this pervasive 80-20 effect where more and more people are having more and more. A smaller slice of people are having a magnified level of influence, and there's this larger chunk of people that's having a level of influence or status that they believe to be well beneath what they're entitled to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I've sort of been looking at recently, I was reading this book called Dataclysm. I can't remember the author's name. It came out a few years ago, but I would imagine that these findings still hold, which is that on social media, I think it was specifically about Twitter, that like the Gini coefficient of followers on Twitter is actually higher than wealth in America. Basically, it's actually much easier to make $1 million than to gain 1 million Twitter followers. And so, yeah, there is of course, we talk a lot about the income inequality, the wealth inequality in the country, and how, whatever, the top 1% has this much compared to the bottom 50%. But in terms of, social media, social influence, and those kinds of things, it's actually even more skewed than that in terms of popularity for musicians, book sales, anything in creative occupations, writing as well. There is this sort of vast inequality there between those two groups, the haves and the have-nots or whatever. One thing that you brought up, you mentioned this idea of having the coupon or the piece of paper. Well, first I wanted to say that it reminded me of, speaking of how dire academia is, something like only 5%. I just read this article, it was in Nature, that 5% of people with PhDs, new graduates, will go on to obtain a tenure track job at a university. It's 5%. So, you're like a 1 in 20 chance, 95% likelihood that you're not going to get that dream job. One thing I find interesting in academia, though, is that that's still sort of expected, that even though we all know 95% of you are not going to get a job in academia, the expectation is you're going to do this. You're going to get a postdoc. You're going to go on to do that.
You're going to bring in grants for the university.
Exactly. But this other thing, this piece of paper idea, I was thinking, okay, so back to this marriage idea for luxury beliefs, I was talking to people about this. A lot of people will say, that marriage is just a piece of paper, and it's sort of in defense of cohabiting, or, sort of in defense of marriage isn't that important. It's really just a piece of paper that we all pretend is something important. And it's sort of I don't know, it sort of denigrates the whole idea of marriage, I guess. It's just a piece of paper. But the way that you phrase it as the academic degree, the diploma or whatever, as a piece of paper, I very seldom hear highly educated people refer to degrees or these academic credentials as just a piece of paper. And I find this interesting because, on the one hand, okay, so if marriage is just a piece of paper, but shouldn't also, your college degree is just a piece of paper too? What's so special about that? But I think part of the reason why it's so seldom referred to as that way is because they derive most of their social status from their education, and they don't want to denigrate it. Yeah,
I think that's right. Part of the reason I speak this way, it's probably an unconscious thing that I learned very early on that I can't shake is, I have a coupon from Harvard, and it's redeemable at all sorts of places for all sorts of stuff. Trust me. But I often refer to it that way, and I'm not even thinking about it. But I was a first generation college student, so I didn't necessarily grow up in an environment where it was talked about in the other way.
So, right. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think I've just sort of internalized that. So it's prestigious, but it is also a piece of paper. Whereas, that would maybe be considered sacrilegious in other social circles to talk about it that way.
Yeah, I kind of like, it was the sad thing. Like if you read like too many statistics, like it can like really, I don't know, either make your perception of the world more accurate or warp it in a way that can sort of ruin it. But, once I learned, for example, that like once you get into a top university, your likelihood of graduation is virtually guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
Harvard, Yale, something like 98 or 99% graduation rates. And so once I realized that getting the letter of admission is more important, like once you get the letter of admission, like that's actually more important than the degree itself.
Yeah, you really have to screw up.
Yeah, if they make sure that you pass basically. And so like on graduation day, I remember like my family was really happy and I was like, this was basically expected to happen. Like, is this really that exciting? Like we all knew that we were going to graduate, right? This is sort of like getting in is the hard part, but graduating isn't actually that difficult. So we should have actually celebrated when I got in.
So what are you actually working on for your PhD research?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. So I just published a paper in evolutionary psychology. It's actually about COVID, finding that people who were more concerned about contracting COVID were more morally judgmental than people who were less concerned. So a lot of my research is actually on moral judgment. And a lot of this is, like I said before, inspired by Jonathan Haidt's work on sort of moral disgust, moral judgment, political differences in sort of moral condemnation. And the thing that I'm working on right now is about the age, sort of the relationship between age and moral judgment, and how there is something going on here with, across time, younger people have become more morally permissive. And my other interesting finding is that older people are more judgmental than younger people for a variety of different kinds of moral violations, controlling for political orientation and all these other kinds of important sociodemographic characteristics.
Interesting. So people who were the most afraid of contracting COVID tended to be the most judgmental. Does this tie in with, and I don't really know too much about this area, but the idea that, moral disgust, feelings related to moral disgust actually relate to our aversiveness to literal biological contagion and sort of drive, the more disgusted you are by stuff, the more you tend to discriminate in-group versus out-group.
Yeah. I mean, so there's this idea of the behavioral immune system, which is, sort of the body's response to potential contaminants. So, there may be overlap between sort of physical disgust and moral disgust. Research on, if people sort of experience this emotion of physical disgust, they're subsequently more judgmental and sort of more cautious and less, or sort of less permissive for a variety of different kinds of behaviors. And like you're saying, they're more sort of groupish, more favorable to the in group and less favorable toward the out group. So there is something there as well. I mean, my finding on COVID and moral judgment, of course, like I think it was, we sort of predicted in advance, and I think a lot of people would, that if you're highly worried about COVID, then you would be harsher towards people who violate, commit moral violations that could potentially spread contamination. So people who say sneeze without covering their mouth, or use someone else's toothbrush without their permission, things like that. Like you would sort of, like, if you're highly worried about COVID, then being worried about those things makes sense. But we also found that people who were worried about COVID were also more judgmental for transgressions, like sort of bribing someone to jump ahead in line, or sort of turning your back on your boss at work, or sort of doing these kinds of like fairness violations, but betraying people, violating some kind of like agreement, loyalty, these kinds of things. So it wasn't just about contamination. And so, I think there is this kind of like this error management thing going on here, where if people are highly concerned about an infectious disease, then they're subsequently going to be hyper cautious towards any kind of wrongdoing that could potentially inflict more harm on them. So there's already this danger that exists. And so I'm not going to take any chances, and I'm going to condemn anyone who could pose an extra level of danger to me. That's sort of the idea here. And one of the more judgmental over time as a result of COVID. So, we ran studies in March, and then later people in May were harsher than people in March, regardless of their level of concern over COVID. And we speculated, we don't know this for sure, but we speculated that this might be the result of prolonged exposure to this ongoing pandemic, that, you know, as the pandemic wore on, people became much more sort of hypervigilant towards any kind of moral wrongdoing. And, you know, I couldn't help but connect that to, like, you know, maybe things are calmed down now. Like, things are sort of, after the vaccines had been released, and maybe things are cooling down somewhat. But for a while, people were very judgmental about, say, like mask wearing and hand washing and all of these things. And I mean, to me, it makes sense. It's sort of it's an adaptive response, I think. You know, if you could potentially get sick, it makes sense to be much more cautious.
Interesting. Well, is there anything, Rob, that you want to leave people with? Any final thoughts on what we've talked about, or can you tell people where to find you in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of interesting things here. You can find me at robkhenderson.com and follow me on Twitter at robkhenderson.
Awesome. Well, Rob, I think you have a really great social media presence. You've sort of, how do I describe it? You've carved out like a nice niche for yourself. So I always know that your feed is going to it could contain a number of things, but they're all within sort of a fairly tight range of topics. So I don't know, it's like picking up a magazine that's about, you know, one topic. I always know that I'm going to get something interesting in the general area of human nature and human psychology. And you also have a newsletter that I subscribe to, and I don't subscribe to many, but yours is one of the more interesting.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Nick.